was the afternoon of April 23rd, 1999, and a call came into 911. It was a local pastor, Arthur Schirmer. Everybody knew him as AB. He said that he was out for a run. He came home and he saw Jewel, his wife, at the bottom of the staircase. She had fallen. When first responders tried to give Jewel medical aid, she immediately started flailing her arms. She definitely was still alive, and she did not want to be touched.
According to EMS providers, she was found at the bottom of the steps with a cord wrapped around her leg. Both shoes are off, and she was brought to Hershey Medical Center.
It was a cold and windy and dreary day, and the phone rang, and my wife answered it, and she came out in the kitchen and said, "It's AB, he wants to talk to you." So I walked in the room, picked up the phone, and he said that my sister Jewel had an accident. The conversation turned for the worse because then he said, "She's in the intensive care unit. They don't think she's gonna make it." When my father and I arrived at the Hershey Medical Center, we walked down this long hallway, and instead of rooms, it was all curtains. So I walked over to that curtain and I pulled it back, and I just stopped dead in my tracks because my sister looked like she got hit by a freight train. 28 hours after that point, I lost my sister, Jewel. Our family was a religious family. My parents were both ministers. Jewel and I were the only children, and she was 13 years older than me. Jewel met AB, I believe it was her second or third year in college.
They had 2 daughters and 1 son. Jewel was well-known and well-loved in her community, that is for sure.
When I've completed an autopsy and give a cause of death and even testify in court, lives are at stake. There were 3 injuries to the head that really stood out then and stand out now.
During the following week, after Jewel passed away, my father told me he wants to go up to the parsonage to see AB. We knocked on the door, rang the doorbell. At one point, he finally opened the door, and I went right out into the kitchen, into the garage, and down into the basement where this supposedly happened. It was just a gut feeling. Something didn't sit right, that she didn't fall down the steps. There was more to it than that. There was a concrete floor, concrete block basement. And you could see where the walls were scrubbed. And I followed the line to where the cleaning stopped. And I looked back at the steps and I'm thinking, if she fell down those steps, why would there be blood all the way over here?
It's 3 tears, 3 lacerations that Jewel Schirmer had. I'm trying to determine, are these lacerations due to somebody striking her with an object, or is it due to a fall? In the case of Jewel Schirmer, I had to rule it ultimately as undetermined. And the reason why I did that is because there was a lot of things that were not done in this particular case. Number 1, there needed to be a crime scene reconstruction. Number 2, there needed to be a blood stain analysis. 3, there needed to be extensive interviews of the husband in this case, and none of those things were done.
Based on the information received from Arthur Schirmer, they decided they didn't need to investigate any further, and they closed the case.
In 2008, I was contacted by the Monroe County District Attorney's Office. And then lo and behold, in that discussion, I found out that Pastor Schirmer had remarried after the death of Jewel Schirmer and had remarried Betty, and that Betty Schirmer had died.
According to Arthur Schirmer, Betty has TMJ. She suffers from some type of jaw issue. About 1:50 a.m. on July 15, 2008, he's driving her and rushing her off to the hospital because of this jaw pain. He's traveling down 715, going to the hospital, when a deer suddenly jumps out in the road. He swerves and strikes a guardrail. He was doing 55 miles an hour. She had just removed her seatbelt prior to this deer jumping into the road. She has blunt force trauma. She's bleeding badly from her head. They treat her first. They bandage her. She's extricated from the car. and immediately taken to the hospital.
Betty was taken by ambulance to the closest hospital, the Pocono Medical Center, which is a trauma center, but she was brain dead and she was taken off of life support.
Betty Schirmer's death was ruled an accident from a motor vehicle collision.
There was never an autopsy performed on Betty Schirmer. And she was cremated within 24 hours of her death.
The officers were talking about how this was the second wife that the Reverend had lost. I remember making the comment, well, that's strange, somebody losing two wives. We found out the Reverend was having an affair with his secretary. Everyone started to wonder, wow, this guy's not who they thought he was. My chief here assigned me to open the crash investigation into Betty Schirmer's death. This is a photograph that I actually call the smoking gun. There's blood drops diluted in the seat. That was very obvious that she was bleeding prior to the crash. She didn't die in that crash. He sat in his car and he let her bleed out.
One of the first tasks that we undertook was to do a full-scale background investigation into Arthur Schirmer.
Arthur married Betty in 2001, which is just 2 years after Jewel's death, and then they moved to the Readers area.
Mr. Schirmer, everywhere he went, he had some type of flirting complaints or sexual harassment complaints. Instead of removing him from that position, they just moved him to another location.
I received a phone call in November of 2008 from Detective Wagner, and he wanted to talk to me. And I'm thinking, what does he want to talk to me about? When it hit me, they're investigating Betty's death because he did it again.
One of the obstacles we had was the fact that Betty Schirmer was not autopsied. But we were able to send CT scans that were done when Betty was brought into Lehigh Valley Medical Center at Cedar Crest.
We have 2 lacerations to the right side of the head and 1 to the back of the head. They were very similar.
After my conversation with Dr. Wayne Ross, I was convinced that I had 2 murders on my hands.
We went back out to the original crime scene where Jewel Schirmer had died, and we had a series of 6 dummies that were also chalked up with chalk. When the head or the body hits, right, the chalk gets wiped off, and that tells us there's an impact there. She did not fall down that flight of steps. You look at the rest of the evidence, and it's obvious it's staged. I amended my report. Coroner reissued a death certificate for Jewel Schirmer, saying that the manner of death was homicide, and that kept the ball rolling in this particular case.
Mr. Schirmer, he doesn't know that we're on to him at all. He still thinks he got away with this crash. I needed to go get a search warrant to locate the actual crime scene at that point. I remember when I walked in the garage area, I could see blood visibly on the concrete, as if he missed it during cleanup. There's still potentially blood evidence present, and we utilize the chemical luminol to help enhance and to help better see that blood, but we can't see with the naked eye. You can start to see that mysterious blood appear in the darkness. Once I find this story tells me that Betty was assaulted somewhere outside the garage with some type of blunt force weapon, such as a crowbar.
That was then packaged and sent to the DNA lab. Once that was processed, that blood did come back to Betty Schirmer. The trial for A.B. Schirmer commenced in January of 2013.
The jury deliberated for a short period of time, and the verdict was guilty. In March of 2013, Reverend Schirmer was sentenced to life in prison without parole for Betty Schirmer's death.